Hey there, mystery hunters. Let's talk about the hairiest controversy in cryptozoology, Bigfoot. Giant footprints mysteriously appearing in remote forests, blurry footage that's been analysed more times than the Zapruder film, and enough eyewitness accounts to fill a phone book. For decades, people have been asking the same question. Is there really an 8-foot-tall hairy dude casually strolling through the Pacific Northwest? Or is this the world's longest-running practical joke? Today we're diving into the footprint evidence, the plaster casts, the dermal ridges, the biomechanics, and yes, the hoaxes that make this whole thing even messier. Before we head into the woods, smash that like button if you're ready to question everything you thought you knew about forest creatures, and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? I want to know if we've got any viewers actually living in Bigfoot country, or if you're safely watching this from your apartment in the city. We're about to examine decades of evidence, expose some legendary fakers, talk to the scientists who've dedicated their careers to this mystery, and figure out whether those massive footprints are proof of an undiscovered primate or just really dedicated pranksters with way too much time on their hands. Buckle up, this is going to get wild. So let's start with the big one, the holy grail of Bigfoot evidence, the footage that's been analysed more times than any celebrity wardrobe malfunction, the Patterson-Gimlin film from October 1967. If you're going to talk about Bigfoot, you can't skip this. It's like discussing ancient Egypt without mentioning the pyramids, or talking about bad decisions without bringing up New Coke. This 59 seconds of grainy, shaky footage has been the subject of more debates, documentaries and dinner arguments than probably any other piece of film in cryptozoology history. Here's what went down. Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin, two guys from Washington who were absolutely convinced Bigfoot was real, headed into the wilderness of Northern California with a rented 16mm camera and a dream. Not exactly the Discovery Channel budget here. We're talking about equipment that would have been considered outdated even by 1967 standards. Patterson had actually written a self-published book about Bigfoot the year before, which tells you exactly how invested this guy was in finding proof. On October 20th, 1967, at a place called Bluff Creek in the Six Rivers National Forest, they allegedly got exactly what they were looking for, and naturally it happened right when they'd almost given up and were heading back. The footage shows what appears to be a large, dark, hairy creature walking across a clearing near a creek bed. The thing turns and looks directly at the camera for a moment. That's the money shot everyone remembers, before casually strolling off into the tree line like it just remembered it left the oven on. Patterson's horse apparently freaked out when they encountered this creature, which is why the footage is so shaky. The camera work makes Blair Witch Project look like it was shot by Steven Spielberg. But here's the thing, that shakiness actually adds to the authenticity debate, because if you were trying to film a genuine mystery creature while your horse is losing its mind, yeah, the footage probably wouldn't be steady. The creature in the film, dubbed Patty by researchers, because apparently even cryptids deserve nicknames, appears to be between 7 and 7.5 feet tall, covered in dark hair, and built like someone who's never skipped leg day. The walking gait is what's fascinating here. This thing moves with a stride length that's significantly longer than what a human would produce at that walking speed. The arms swing in a way that looks natural for the proportions shown, and there's visible muscle movement under the hair on the legs and back. You can see what appears to be breasts on the creature, which is why researchers concluded it's female, not exactly a detail your average hoaxer in 1967 would think to include when they're trying to create a scary monster. Now, Patterson and Gimlin's story is that they immediately made plaster casts of the footprints this creature left behind. The prints measured 14.5 inches long and showed details that would become crucial to the ongoing debate. We're talking about a creature that, based on the stride length and footprint depth, would have weighed somewhere between 500 and 700 pounds. That's not your average guy in a gorilla suit from the local costume shop, which in 1967 probably looked more like a sad pile of fake fur held together with hope and staples. Here's where it gets interesting, and controversial naturally. The film was examined by everyone from Hollywood special effects experts to primatologists to biomechanics specialists. Some looked at it and said, "That's clearly a person in a suit, case closed, next mystery please." Others examined the same footage and went, "Wait a minute, there are some seriously weird things happening here that don't match human anatomy or movement patterns." Both groups were absolutely convinced they were right, and decades later they still are. It's like the dress that broke the internet. Is it blue and black or white and gold? except with significantly more hair and way higher stakes for the reputation of everyone involved. The skeptics had some solid points. First off, Roger Patterson desperately needed this footage to be real. He'd invested time, money, and his credibility into the existence of Bigfoot. Finding conclusive evidence would have vindicated everything he'd been claiming. That's a pretty strong motivation to, shall we say, enhance reality a bit. Plus, the timing was suspiciously convenient. They just happened to have a camera, just happened to encounter this creature, and just happened to get usable footage despite all the chaos. That's either incredible luck or incredible planning, depending on which side of the debate you're on. Then there's Bob Hieronymus, a guy who came forward in the late 1990s claiming he was the one in the suit. He said Patterson had hired him to play Bigfoot, gave him a costume, and filmed him walking through the creek bed. Hieronymus even described details about the suit that seemed plausible. But here's the problem with his story. He couldn't produce the suit, couldn't demonstrate the walk convincingly, and his timeline didn't quite match up with other verified facts about that day. Plus, he waited almost 30 years to come forward, which is a pretty long time to keep quiet about being part of the most famous cryptid hoax in history. Usually people who successfully pull off hoaxes can't wait to brag about it. It's like human nature's worst kept secret. The believers, meanwhile, pointed to some genuinely puzzling elements. Multiple analysis teams examined the creature's gait and concluded that replicating that specific walking pattern would be extremely difficult for a human, even one in a costume. The stride length, the arm swing, the way the creature's weight shifted, these don't quite match human biomechanics. A person walking that slowly would naturally take shorter steps. To achieve that stride length at that pace would require deliberately walking in an unnatural way, which would be visible in other aspects of the movement. Yet the overall motion looks fluid and natural, not forced or awkward. Then there's the muscle movement visible beneath the fur. Several experts noted what appeared to be muscles flexing and contracting in the creature's legs and back as it walked. In 1967, creating a suit with built-in fake muscles that moved realistically wasn't really a thing. Hollywood was still a few years away from that level of special effects sophistication. We're talking about an era when the most advanced creature costume in mainstream movies was the Planet of the Apes makeup, and that took teams of professional artists months to develop. Patterson allegedly created something more sophisticated in his backyard with a budget of basically zero. That's either genius-level special effects work or the creature was real. The anatomical proportions are another interesting detail. The creature's arm length appears to be longer than what you'd expect on a human, even accounting for perspective and camera angles. The shoulders are broader, the neck appears shorter and thicker, and the overall body proportions don't quite match Homo sapiens standards. Some anthropologists who examined the footage noted that while you could potentially fake a costume with weird proportions, getting a human to move naturally inside that costume while maintaining those proportions is a different challenge entirely. It's like trying to make a convincing dinosaur costume where the actor's legs have to work the dinosaur's back legs, while the fake front legs just dangle. It never looks quite right because human anatomy keeps interfering. Jeff Meldrum, a professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University, who's probably examined this footage more times than anyone should have to, pointed out some specific details that caught his attention. The way the creature's foot flexes as it walks shows what appears to be a mid-tarsal break. Basically, the foot bends in the middle in a way that human feet don't normally do. Modern humans have rigid feet with a nice arch that helps us walk efficiently. Some other primates have a more flexible midfoot that allows for better tree climbing. If this creature is showing a mid-tarsal break in its walking pattern, that's either an incredibly sophisticated detail for a hoaxer to include, or it's evidence of a real biological feature. Neither option is particularly comforting, honestly. The film quality itself has been both a blessing and a curse for analysis. On one hand, it's grainy enough that you can't see fine details clearly, which means it's impossible to definitively prove or disprove anything. On the other hand, that graininess is exactly what you'd expect from cheap 1967 camera equipment, which actually supports the authenticity of the circumstances if not necessarily the content. Multiple experts have enhanced, stabilized, and analyzed the footage using modern technology, but here's the frustrating thing. Better analysis techniques haven't settled the debate. If anything, they've made it more complex because now both sides have even more technical details to argue about. Hollywood special effects artists have weighed in repeatedly over the decades. John Chambers, who did the makeup for Planet of the Apes and was basically a god in the special effects community, reportedly looked at the Patterson-Gimlin film and said there was no way that was a costume. Except there's debate about whether he actually said that or if it's an urban legend that grew in the retelling. Other effects artists have insisted it's absolutely a costume and they could replicate it easily. But here's the catch. When people have actually tried to recreate the footage with modern costumes and technology, the results always look noticeably different. Maybe that proves the original was real, or maybe it just proves that whatever technique was used in 1967 got lost to time. Not exactly conclusive either way. The footprints Patterson and Gimlin cast after filming the creature added another layer to the controversy. These weren't just generic big footprints. They showed details like dermal ridges, which are the equivalent of fingerprints on your feet. Now, back in 1967, the general public wasn't really aware that dermal ridges were a thing that could be analysed forensically. Including that level of detail in a fake footprint would require knowledge that most people simply didn't have. Of course, skeptics argue that natural variations in the casting process could create ridge-like patterns that might be mistaken for dermal ridges. So even this smoking gun evidence dissolves into another round of yes it is, no it isn't arguments. The cultural impact of this footage is undeniable, regardless of its authenticity. Before Patterson-Gimlin, Bigfoot was mostly a regional legend that occasionally popped up in newspaper stories when someone reported seeing something weird in the woods. After this footage hit the media, Bigfoot became a nationwide phenomenon. Suddenly everyone was talking about it, looking for it, making documentaries about it. The image of that creature looking back at the camera became iconic. You've probably seen it parodied in everything from cartoons to commercials. Not bad for 59 seconds of controversial footage from a barely functional camera. What's really fascinating is how this film has held up over time. Usually when hoaxes age, they become more obvious. Special effects that looked convincing in their era become laughably fake with modern eyes. Think about those UFO photos from the 1950s that were clearly just hubcaps thrown in the air. They fooled people then, but now they're obvious. The Patterson-Gimlin film hasn't followed that pattern. If anything, the more technology advances and the more we learn about biomechanics and primate anatomy, the more puzzling the footage becomes. It either gets more convincing as evidence of something genuinely unknown, or it becomes even more impressive as a hoax that somehow included details the hoaxer shouldn't have known about. Both Patterson and Gimlin stuck to their story for the rest of their lives. Patterson died in 1972, just 5 years after filming the footage, still claiming it was absolutely real. Gimlin is still alive as of the 2020s and continues to maintain that what they filmed was a genuine unknown creature. He's been offered money, fame, and plenty of opportunities to admit it was a hoax if it was, but he's never wavered. Now that could mean it's real, or it could mean he's just committed to the bit for over 50 years, which honestly would be almost as impressive as filming an actual Bigfoot. The scientific community's reaction has been mixed, to put it mildly. Most mainstream scientists won't touch Bigfoot research with a 10-foot pole because it's career suicide. You want to study an established field like genetics or ecology? Great, here's funding and respect. You want to study whether a giant ape man is hiding in North America? Good luck getting tenure. So the researchers who do take it seriously often exist on the fringes of academia, which unfortunately makes it easier for critics to dismiss their work. It's a frustrating cycle. Serious scientists avoid the topic because it's not taken seriously, which means it doesn't get serious scientific attention, which means it continues not being taken seriously. Here's what we know for certain. The Patterson-Gimlin film exists. It shows something large and hairy walking through the woods, and nobody has definitively proven what that something is in over 50 years of trying. The footage has been called everything from the greatest hoax in cryptozoology history to genuine evidence of an unknown primate species. What it definitely did was set the standard for all future Bigfoot evidence. Every footprint cast, every blurry photo, every thermal image gets compared back to this one piece of film from 1967. Those footprints this creature left behind became the gold standard. Researchers would measure new prints against the Patterson-Gimlin prints to check for consistency. The debate shows no signs of being resolved anytime soon. New analysis techniques get developed, both sides get excited thinking this will finally settle things, and then somehow the results manage to support both interpretations simultaneously. It's like the universe is deliberately messing with us at this point. Maybe that's the real mystery, not whether Bigfoot exists, but how a single piece of footage can remain this controversial for this long, without anyone definitively proving it one way or the other. What we're left with is a 59-second film clip that's been examined frame by frame thousands of times, that's been the subject of countless documentaries and debates, and that continues to frustrate both believers and skeptics because neither side can. Land the knockout punch? The creature walks across the clearing, glances back at the camera like it's mildly annoyed at being interrupted, and disappears into the forest, leaving behind footprints, questions, and one of the most enduring mysteries in cryptozoology. Not bad for a random Friday in October 1967, and here's the thing. Whether you think it's a guy in a suit or a genuine unknown creature, you have to admit the film achieved something remarkable. It kept the mystery alive, sparked decades of research and investigation, and gave us an image that's become part of popular culture. Those footprints led researchers into the wilderness looking for answers, which led to more evidence, more questions, and the whole elaborate mess we're about to dive into. So love it or hate it, believe it or dismiss it. The Patterson-Gimlin footage is where modern Bigfoot research really begins. Everything else is just a footnote to those 59 seconds of controversy. Now that we've established the Patterson-Gimlin footage as the gold standard of Bigfoot evidence, let's talk about what happens when researchers actually find footprints in the wilderness and decide to get scientific about it. Because here's the thing, you can't just look at a giant footprint in the mud and go, yep, that's definitely Bigfoot, and call it a day. Well, you can, but then you're not doing science, you're just enthusiastically jumping to conclusions, which is fun but not particularly useful for actually solving mysteries. The study of footprints is called ichnology in the scientific community, which sounds way fancier than it actually is. Researchers have been analysing tracks left by animals and humans for basically as long as humans have been paying attention to their surroundings. Ancient hunters used tracking skills to find prey, modern forensic investigators use footprint analysis to solve crimes, and somewhere in between, we've got people applying these same techniques to alleged evidence of an 8-foot-tall mystery. Primate. It's like CSI meets Wild Kingdom, except everyone involved probably wishes they had better funding and fewer people laughing at their research proposals. When someone finds what they believe is a Bigfoot footprint, the first step is documentation. And I mean serious documentation, not just snapping a quick photo with your phone and posting it on social media with a caption like, "Look what I found, LOL." Professional researchers photograph the print from multiple angles, measure everything. Measurable? Note the substrate it's in, document the surrounding environment, check for other prints in the area, and basically treat it like a crime scene. Which makes sense, because if you're trying to prove the existence of an unknown species, you need evidence that'll hold up to scrutiny from people who really don't want to believe you. The gold standard for preserving a footprint is making a plaster cast. This technique has been used in forensic science for over a century, because unlike photographs, a cast gives you a 3-dimensional replica you can analyze from every angle. The process sounds simple. Pour plaster into the footprint, let it harden, pull it out carefully, but there's actually an art to doing it right. Pour too fast and you might damage fine details. Don't reinforce it properly and it'll break when you try to remove it. Use the wrong type of plaster, and the cast won't capture the subtle features that separate interesting evidence from definitive proof. Unfortunately, many alleged Bigfoot footprint casts were made by enthusiastic amateurs who had no idea what they were doing, which means we've got boxes of evidence that are basically worthless for serious analysis. It's like trying to solve a murder with crime scene photos that are all blurry and taken from bad angles. Technically evidence, but not helpful evidence. Once you've got a cast, that's when the real science begins. Researchers examine these things with the kind of attention to detail that would make a jeweler nervous. They're looking at depth variations, ridge patterns, the way different parts of the print show different pressure levels, asymmetries that might indicate natural variation versus deliberate fakery, and about 50 other factors that separate this. Might be something from, this is definitely just Steve from accounting playing a prank. Let's start with the basics, size and shape. A genuine biological footprint will show certain characteristics that are really difficult to fake convincingly. The depth should vary based on weight distribution, with the heel and ball of the foot creating deeper impressions than the arch or toes. If you're looking at a print that's uniformly deep across the entire surface, congratulations, you've probably found evidence of someone stomping around in wooden fake feet, which is less exciting but at least definitively proves something. Real feet flex and shift weight as they walk, creating a pressure map that tells a story about how that creature moves. The substrate matters enormously in footprint analysis. Mud, sand, snow and soil all take impressions differently, and experts need to account for these variations. A print in wet sand might look dramatically different from the same foot stepping in clay, even though it's the same biological appendage making both impressions. This is where things get complicated, because skeptics can argue that weird features in a print are just artifacts of the substrate, while believers insist those same features are evidence of genuine biological details. Both arguments can be correct depending on the specific print in question, which is why this field gives everyone involved stress headaches. Now let's talk about dermal ridges, because this is where the analysis gets really interesting. You know how your fingerprints are unique patterns of ridges on your fingertips? Your feet have the same thing, dermal ridges on the soles that create friction and help with grip. In human footprints, these ridges show up in high-quality casts as tiny linear patterns, and they're unique to each individual. They're also really, really hard to fake, because most people don't even know they exist until someone points them out. Some Bigfoot footprint casts show what appear to be dermal ridges. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough to make researchers seriously question whether they're looking at hoaxes or genuine biological evidence. The ridges in these casts don't match human patterns. They're spaced differently, oriented differently, and show features that don't correspond to Homo sapiens' foot anatomy. Either someone went to absolutely extraordinary lengths to create fake footprints, with convincing fake dermal ridges that don't match any known primate, or these prints came from something real. Neither explanation is particularly comforting if you think about it too hard. The controversy around dermal ridges is intense. Skeptics argue that random variations in the casting process can create ridge-like patterns that might look biological but are actually just artifacts. Pour plaster into mud, and as it sets, it might create tiny lines that could be mistaken for dermal ridges by an overeager researcher. It's a fair point. Confirmation bias is a real thing, and when you're desperately hoping to find proof of Bigfoot, you might see meaningful patterns in random noise. It's like seeing shapes in clouds, except with significantly more academic careers on the line. Supporters counter that the dermal ridges in quality casts show consistent patterns across multiple prints from the same alleged creature, flow in anatomically logical directions, and appear in casts made by different researchers in different locations using different techniques. The consistency argument is compelling. If these are random artifacts from the casting process, why do they keep showing up with similar characteristics? Random processes should produce random results, not consistent patterns that mimic biological features. It's a genuinely puzzling situation that hasn't been resolved despite decades of argument. Weight distribution analysis is another crucial tool in the footprint investigation toolkit. When a creature walks, it doesn't just plop its feet down with uniform pressure across the entire surface. The heel strikes first, taking most of the impact, then weight rolls forward across the foot toward the toes as the step completes. This creates a pressure gradient that shows up in high-quality footprints as variations in depth and definition. Forensic experts can look at a footprint and determine not just the approximate weight of whoever made it, but also their gait, whether they were running or walking, and even potential health issues based on unusual weight distribution. When researchers apply this analysis to alleged Bigfoot prints, some interesting patterns emerge. Many of the better documented prints show weight distribution consistent with a creature that weighs significantly more than a human. We're talking 600 to 800 pounds based on the depth and spread of the impressions. That's roughly the weight of a male gorilla, which makes sense if we're talking about an unknown great ape. The problem is, a human in a costume isn't going to weigh 600 pounds unless they're in a costume made entirely of lead, which would make walking pretty much impossible. So either these prints are genuine, or hoaxers figured out how to create impressions that look like they came from something much heavier than a human. Spoiler alert, the second option isn't as simple as it sounds. Pressure points are particularly revealing. In a genuine biological footprint, certain areas will show more pressure than others based on bone structure and how the foot flexes during walking. Human feet have a specific architecture. The heel, the ball of the foot, and the toes all create distinct pressure zones. Some alleged Bigfoot prints show pressure patterns that don't match human anatomy. The pressure distribution suggests a foot structure that's similar to human feet but not identical, like the difference between driving a sedan and driving an SUV. Same basic concept, different execution. Gait analysis takes this even further by looking at multiple footprints in sequence. When you walk, your steps follow a predictable pattern based on your height, leg length, and how your body moves. The distance between footprints, the angle at which they're placed, and the slight variations from one step to the next all tell a story about the creature that made them. Forensic experts use gait analysis to identify individuals from footprint evidence at crime scenes, because even if two people wear the same shoe size, their walking patterns will be different. Alleged Bigfoot trackways, that's the technical term for a series of footprints left by a single creature, show stride lengths that consistently exceed what you'd expect from a human walking at that apparent speed. We're talking about steps that are 3 to 4 feet apart, sometimes more, left by a creature that wasn't running or jumping but just casually strolling through the forest, like it was out for a leisurely walk. For a human to create that stride length, they'd need to be deliberately taking exaggerated steps, which would create an awkward, unnatural walking pattern. The prints would show signs of that awkwardness: unusual weight distribution, scuff marks, inconsistent spacing. Many of the better documented trackways don't show these telltale signs of fakery, which either means the hoaxers were biomechanics geniuses or the tracks are legitimate. The angle of the footprints relative to each other also matters. When humans walk, our feet naturally angle slightly outward. We're not perfectly parallel-footed unless we're deliberately walking that way, which looks and feels weird. Some alleged Bigfoot tracks show a similar slight outward angle, while others are more parallel or even slightly inward. These variations could indicate different individuals with different natural gaits, or they could indicate different hoaxers with different ideas about how Bigfoot should walk. The evidence doesn't conclusively support either interpretation, which is basically the theme of this entire field of study. One fascinating technique borrowed from forensic science is looking for what's called secondary characteristics. These are the little details that show up in footprints beyond just the basic shape. Things like skin texture, toe flexion, the way the substrate deforms around the edges of the print. In human footprints, you might see the texture of the shoe sole, or if it's a barefoot print, the way the toes grip the ground. In alleged Bigfoot prints, researchers look for similar subtle details that would be extremely difficult to fake. Some casts show what appears to be skin texture, individual toe definition, and edge deformation patterns consistent with a large, heavy creature stepping into soft ground. The challenge with secondary characteristics is that they're subject to interpretation. One researcher might look at a pattern and see skin texture, while another sees random artifacts from the terrain or casting process. Without a known Bigfoot foot to compare against, which is kind of the whole problem here, it's impossible to say definitively what constitutes genuine secondary characteristics versus coincidental patterns. It's like trying to determine if a photograph shows a ghost or just camera artifacts when you have no confirmed photographs of actual ghosts to use as a reference. The lack of a baseline makes everything speculative. Modern technology has added new tools to the footprint analysis arsenal. 3D scanning can capture every minute detail of a cast, allowing researchers to analyze it digitally and share data with colleagues around the world. Computer modeling can simulate how prints would look if made by creatures with different weights, foot structures, and gaits. Some researchers have even used specialized equipment to test the substrate where prints were found, trying to determine exactly what kind of force and weight distribution would be needed to create those impressions. It's impressive technology applied to a question that most scientists won't touch with a 10-foot pole, which is either dedication or stubbornness depending on your perspective. The forensic comparison to known fakes is crucial for developing detection methods. When hoaxes are exposed and the fake feet used to create them are recovered, researchers can study exactly what features distinguish these fraudulent prints from potentially genuine ones. Fake prints made with carved wooden feet, for example, show certain telltale characteristics: unnaturally uniform depth, lack of natural flex, edge details that don't match how real skin would interact with substrate. Over time, investigators have built up a catalogue of these red flags that help them identify likely hoaxes more quickly. But here's the frustrating part: hoax detection is only useful up to a point. Just because a print doesn't show obvious signs of being fake doesn't automatically mean it's real. Absence of evidence for fakery isn't the same as evidence of authenticity, though that distinction sometimes gets lost in the excitement of finding prints that seem to pass all the tests. The scientific method requires positive evidence, not just the elimination of obvious alternatives. The statistical analysis of multiple prints is another approach researchers use. If you find one weird footprint, that's interesting but not conclusive. If you find dozens of prints from different locations made by different alleged individuals over many years, and they all show consistent anatomical features that differ from human feet in the same ways, that starts to look like a pattern. The consistency argument is powerful. Either there's a sophisticated network of hoaxes all creating fake prints with identical non-human characteristics, or some of these prints might be genuine evidence of an unknown creature. Neither option is particularly likely, which is what makes this whole thing so maddeningly unresolved. There's also the temporal aspect to consider. Some footprints were found and documented decades before certain anatomical features were even known to researchers. The mid-tarsal break I mentioned in the Patterson-Gimlin discussion. That wasn't common knowledge in the 1960s and 70s, yet some prints from that era show evidence of it. It's similar to the dermal ridge situation. If hoaxes were including details that weren't widely known at the time, that suggests either incredibly sophisticated fakes or genuine biological evidence. The temporal argument doesn't prove anything definitively, but it does make the hoax explanation more complicated. The experimental approach has also yielded interesting results. Some researchers have tried to replicate alleged Bigfoot prints using various hoaxing methods to see what's actually possible. They've used wooden feet, molds, mechanical devices, and even people in costumes with modified feet to see if they can create prints that match the characteristics of the better documented alleged Bigfoot tracks. The results have been mixed. Some features can be replicated fairly easily, while others remain stubbornly difficult to fake convincingly. The fact that even with modern technology and knowledge, researchers struggle to create prints that match all the characteristics of the best alleged Bigfoot evidence is interesting, though again, not definitive proof of anything. What we're left with is a collection of analytical techniques borrowed from legitimate forensic science, applied to a question that exists somewhere between cryptozoology and wishful thinking. The science itself is solid. Footprint analysis is a real discipline with real applications in criminal investigation and wildlife research. The controversy comes from applying these techniques to evidence that might not be evidence at all, depending on who you ask and what they had for breakfast that morning. The takeaway from all this scientific analysis is that footprint examination can tell us a lot about what created a particular impression, but only if we're honest about the limitations of the techniques and careful about our interpretations. Some alleged Bigfoot prints are obvious fakes that fall apart under scrutiny. Others remain genuinely puzzling despite extensive analysis, and a whole lot fall somewhere in the middle, not obviously fake, but not convincingly real either. The science gives us tools to examine the evidence, but it can't force the evidence to give us clear answers, which is probably why everyone involved in this field seems perpetually frustrated with each other. So there you have it, the science of footprint analysis applied to the world's hairiest mystery. It's legitimate forensic technique meeting controversial cryptozoological evidence, with results that somehow manage to satisfy absolutely no one while keeping the debate alive for decades. Not exactly a ringing endorsement, but at least it's honest. Now that we've covered all the serious science behind footprint analysis, let's address the massive hairy elephant in the room, or more accurately, the massive hairy fake creature that keeps showing up in forests across North America. Because here's the uncomfortable truth that everyone in Bigfoot research has to deal with. This field is absolutely crawling with hoaxers, pranksters, attention seekers, and people who thought it would be hilarious to mess with researchers. And honestly, some of these hoaxes are so elaborate, so committed, and so successful at fooling people that you almost have to respect the dedication, even while being frustrated that they've made legitimate research basically impossible. Let's start with the granddaddy of them all, the hoax that arguably launched the modern Bigfoot phenomenon into the mainstream, and then turned out to be completely fake. In August 1958, a guy named Gerald Crew was working construction at a road building site near Bluff Creek in Northern California, when he and his co-workers started finding enormous footprints around their equipment. We're talking about prints that measured around 16 inches long, which is roughly the size of a decent pizza, except instead of delicious toppings, we're talking about alleged evidence of an unknown primate. The tracks appeared repeatedly over several days, always overnight, always in areas where the construction crew would definitely find them the next morning. Crew, being a reasonable human who'd probably never considered the possibility of giant mystery apes before this, made plaster casts of the prints and took them to the local newspaper. The paper ran the story because, let's be honest, Giant mystery footprints found at construction site is a way better headline than road construction continues uneventfully. The story got picked up by other newspapers, then by wire services, and before you know it, the whole country was talking about these mysterious tracks. The term Bigfoot was coined by a newspaper columnist to describe whatever was leaving these impressions, and boom, a legend was born. It was basically the 1950s version of going viral, except instead of social media it involved actual printed newspapers that people had to physically purchase, which seems quaint now. The tracks kept appearing for weeks. Crew and his colleagues found them near their bulldozers, around their equipment, sometimes even on top of equipment in ways that seemed physically impossible for anything to reach. The prints showed up in sequences that suggested whatever made them was walking around the construction site like it owned the place, possibly conducting a nightly inspection of the work quality. The whole situation was bizarre, fascinating, and exactly the kind of mystery that captures public imagination. Here's the plot twist that nobody saw coming at the time. The whole thing was a hoax. The prints were made by a guy named Raymond Wallace, who was actually one of the contractors working on the road construction project. Ray had apparently decided that the best use of his time and energy was creating fake Bigfoot tracks, using carved wooden feet that he'd strap to his boots and stomp around the construction site at night. Why would someone do this? Great question. According to his family, who came forward decades after his death in 2002, Ray just thought it would be funny. He wanted to mess with his co-workers, scare them a bit, and have a good laugh. What he accidentally did was launch an entire cryptozoological phenomenon that would last for decades and convince millions of people that giant apes were hiding in North American forests. The reveal came way too late to undo the damage, or the cultural impact, depending on how you look at it. By the time Wallace's family admitted the truth, Bigfoot was thoroughly embedded in popular culture. The legend had taken on a life of its own, spawning countless investigations, research organizations, documentaries, and enough merchandise to fill several warehouses. Trying to put that genie back in the bottle would be like trying to convince people that Santa Claus was actually just your uncle in a costume. Technically true, but good luck getting anyone to believe you or care at this point. The Wallace hoax is particularly frustrating because it demonstrates how one person with carved wooden feet and too much free time can create evidence that fools experts for years. Those plaster casts from Bluff Creek were examined by researchers, declared genuinely mysterious by some investigators, and used as baseline comparison for future footprint discoveries. The fact that they were fake from day one means that a significant chunk of early Bigfoot research was built on a foundation of pranks and nonsense. It's like discovering that a major archaeological site was actually just elaborate set dressing from a movie. Embarrassing for everyone involved and really unhelpful for actual research. But wait, there's more hoaxes where that came from, because apparently the bar for I'm going to create fake Bigfoot evidence is remarkably low. Let's talk about the frozen corpse incident from 2008, which managed to fool the media for about 48 hours before falling apart spectacularly. Two guys in Georgia, Matthew Whitten and Rick Dyer, held a press conference claiming they'd found a dead Bigfoot in the woods and had it frozen in a block of ice. Not just any dead Bigfoot, mind you, a 7-foot-tall specimen that they insisted was genuine. They had photos showing what looked like a hairy body encased in ice, and they were extremely confident about their discovery, which should have been the first red flag because genuine discoveries usually come with a hefty dose of, "we're not entirely sure what we're looking at here," rather than "definitely Bigfoot, no question." The media ate it up initially. Here was physical evidence, they claimed, not just footprints or blurry photos, but an actual body. The press conference made national news. People were excited, skeptical, curious, all the emotions you'd expect when someone claims to have found proof of a cryptid. Then someone actually examined the body and discovered it was a rubber gorilla suit filled with roadkill and frozen in a cooler. Not even a good gorilla suit. We're talking about something you could probably order online for a Halloween party, stuffed with possum entrails and whatever else they could find, then frozen to make it look more convincing from the outside. The whole thing collapsed faster than a house of cards in a wind tunnel. Whitten and Dyer's hoax is a perfect example of what happens when ambition exceeds ability and common sense takes a permanent vacation. They wanted fame, they wanted money, they wanted to be the guys who solved the Bigfoot mystery, but they didn't want to actually find Bigfoot. So they decided to manufacture evidence, held a press conference before anyone credible could examine their claim, and assumed they'd get away with it somehow. The plan had more holes than Swiss cheese, and unsurprisingly it failed miserably. Both guys faced legal consequences, lost their jobs, and became punchlines in the Bigfoot research community. Not exactly the outcome they were hoping for when they stuffed that gorilla suit with roadkill. The motivations behind Bigfoot hoaxes vary wildly. Some people do it for attention, wanting their 15 minutes of fame and the social media followers that come with claiming you've encountered a mystery creature. Others do it for money. There's a market for Bigfoot tours, books, appearances at conventions, and all sorts of monetizable content if you can convince people you're a legitimate researcher or witness. Some hoaxers genuinely seem to enjoy the chaos they create, watching researchers get excited about fake evidence and then laughing at them from the sidelines. And a surprising number of hoaxes appear to be motivated by nothing more than, "I was bored and this seemed funny at the time," which is possibly the most frustrating reason of all. The problem with hoaxes isn't just that they waste researchers' time and resources, though they absolutely do that. The bigger issue is that they poison the well for any legitimate evidence that might exist. When you've been fooled by fake footprints, fake photographs, and fake frozen corpses enough times, you start assuming everything is fake by default. Researchers develop such intense skepticism that even genuinely anomalous evidence gets dismissed as probably just another hoax, without proper investigation. It's the boy who cried wolf effect, except instead of one boy, we've got dozens of them crying wolf simultaneously, and maybe one of them actually saw a wolf, but nobody believes them anymore because of all the false alarms. Learning to spot hoaxes has become an essential skill in Bigfoot research, almost more important than actually knowing how to analyze potential evidence. Investigators now look for specific red flags that suggest fakery. Is the evidence too perfect, too clear, too conveniently discovered? That's suspicious. Does the person who found it have financial motivations like a book to sell or a tour company to promote? Major red flag. Are they refusing to let qualified experts examine the evidence independently? Basically a confession. Does their story change when pressed for details? Hoax alert. Did they immediately run to the media before contacting any researchers? Almost certainly fake. Tool marks are another giveaway in footprint hoaxes. When someone carves wooden feet or creates molds to make fake prints, they leave behind evidence of the manufacturing process. Sharp edges that wouldn't exist in biological tissue, uniform depth across the entire print because the fake foot is rigid, lack of natural variation between prints because they're using the same fake foot every time. Experienced researchers can spot these characteristics pretty quickly, but only if they're actually looking for them. The early days of Bigfoot research were full of people who wanted to believe so badly that they overlooked obvious signs of fakery, because accepting the evidence as genuine was more exciting than exposing it as fraud. The sophistication of hoaxes has increased over time, which is both impressive and deeply annoying. Early hoaxers like Wallace used relatively simple techniques, carved wooden feet and some determination. Modern hoaxers have access to better materials, 3D printing, special effects knowledge from YouTube tutorials, and detailed information about what researchers look for in genuine evidence. Some contemporary hoaxes include features like dermal ridges and anatomically plausible pressure patterns, specifically because hoaxers know that's what experts will examine. It's an arms race between investigators developing better detection methods and hoaxers developing better faking techniques, and honestly, nobody's winning except maybe the people selling plaster for making casts. Social media has made the hoax problem exponentially worse. In the pre-internet era, creating fake Bigfoot evidence required actual effort. You had to physically make something, find a way to photograph it, get it to the media, and hope they'd run your story. Now you can Photoshop an image on your phone, post it online with a dramatic caption, and reach thousands of people before breakfast. The barrier to entry for hoaxing has essentially disappeared, and we're drowning in fake evidence as a result. Every blurry photo of a dark shape in the woods gets shared as definitive proof. Every obvious costume gets labelled as a genuine encounter, and researchers spend more time debunking nonsense on social media than actually investigating potentially interesting cases. The YouTube monetization factor has created a whole new category of hoaxers, people who produce fake Bigfoot content specifically to generate ad revenue. They'll stage elaborate encounters, edit together misleading footage, make breathless claims about revolutionary evidence, and rake in views from curious people who don't realize they're watching carefully constructed fiction. Some of these channels are remarkably successful financially, which just encourages more people to try their hand at manufacturing fake cryptid content. It's a depressing cycle where financial incentives reward fraud and punish honest research. Exposing hoaxes requires a combination of technical analysis, investigative work, and sometimes just waiting for the hoaxer to get impatient and reveal themselves. Some hoaxes fall apart immediately under scrutiny. The evidence is so obviously fake that even casual observers can tell something's wrong. Others require extensive analysis, comparing the alleged evidence against known characteristics of genuine biological specimens and looking for inconsistencies. The best hoax exposures come from finding the actual tools used to create the fake evidence, like those wooden feet that Wallace's family eventually produced, or catching the hoaxer in the act of creating fake prints. The psychological impact of hoaxes on genuine witnesses is something that doesn't get discussed enough. If you've actually seen something unexplained in the woods, whether it's Bigfoot or some other unknown creature, coming forward with your story means risking being lumped in with hoaxers and attention seekers. You might genuinely have witnessed something anomalous, but because there's such a long history of fakes and frauds, people will automatically assume you're either lying or mistaken. This creates a situation where potential valuable witness testimony never gets reported, because people don't want to deal with the mockery and skepticism that comes with Bigfoot claims. The scientific community's general refusal to engage with Bigfoot research is partly a hoax problem. When a field is this thoroughly contaminated with fraudulent evidence, serious scientists stay far away because association with it can damage their careers. Why would a tenured professor risk their professional reputation investigating something that's been hoaxed so many times? Even if they found genuinely interesting evidence, they'd struggle to publish it in peer-reviewed journals because the entire topic has been poisoned by decades of fakes. It's a vicious cycle that hoaxers have inadvertently, or maybe deliberately, created. Some hoaxers eventually feel guilty and confess, like Wallace's family did decades after his death. Others double down and stick to their stories forever, even in the face of overwhelming evidence that they were lying. A few seem to genuinely forget that they were hoaxing and start to believe their own fabrications, which creates a weird psychological situation where the hoaxer becomes a true believer in their own fake evidence. Human memory is unreliable enough that if you tell a story often enough, you can convince yourself it actually happened the way you're describing it, even if you made the whole thing up originally. The economics of hoaxing are interesting when you actually break them down. Creating convincing fake Bigfoot evidence requires time, materials, knowledge, and effort. You need to understand what researchers look for so you can include those features. You need to physically create the fake evidence, deploy it somewhere appropriate, document it convincingly, and then maintain your story under questioning. That's a lot of work for rewards that are usually pretty minimal unless you manage to monetize it successfully. Most hoaxers put in tremendous effort for relatively little payoff, which suggests motivations beyond simple financial gain. Ego, entertainment value, or the thrill of fooling experts seem to be bigger drivers than money for most people. The legacy of hoaxes in Bigfoot research is fundamentally tragic. We've got a field of inquiry that might have legitimate questions worth investigating. Are there unknown large primates in North America? Could something have evaded detection in remote wilderness areas? What's behind the consistent pattern of reports from credible witnesses? But these questions can't get serious scientific attention because the field is so thoroughly associated with frauds and fakes. Every hoax makes it harder for legitimate research to happen, creates more skepticism around the entire topic, and pushes genuine investigation further to the margins of respectability. Understanding hoaxes is essential for anyone trying to evaluate Bigfoot evidence, not because it's fun to expose fakes, though it kind of is, but because you can't identify potentially genuine evidence until you can reliably eliminate the fake stuff. It's like being a wine expert who needs to taste a lot of bad wine to really appreciate the good bottles. You need to know what hoaxed footprints look like to recognize prints that don't match those characteristics. You need to understand how people create fake photographs so you can identify images that show features inconsistent with known hoaxing techniques. The Faker's Hall of Shame is unfortunately pretty crowded, with new inductees joining regularly as modern hoaxers continue creating fake evidence with varying degrees of sophistication. From Wallace's wooden feet launching the modern phenomenon to frozen gorilla suits making headlines in the internet age, the creativity and persistence of hoaxers has been remarkable. Not admirable exactly, but definitely remarkable. They've shaped the field of Bigfoot research as much as any legitimate investigator, just in the opposite direction, making everything harder, more controversial, and less credible with every fake footprint and fabricated sighting. So there's your tour through the gallery of fakes, frauds, and people who really should have found better hobbies. The hoaxes range from almost charming pranks to cynical attempts at profiting from gullibility, and they've collectively done more damage to Bigfoot research than decades of skeptical scientists ever could. But understanding these fakes is crucial, because only by knowing what fraudulent evidence looks like can we even begin to evaluate whether any of the alleged Bigfoot evidence might actually be real. And speaking of potentially real evidence, let's move on to some of the more puzzling findings that haven't been definitively exposed as hoaxes yet. After that tour through the Hall of Shame and all those hoaxes that have made Bigfoot research look like a joke, let's talk about someone who's actually trying to apply legitimate science to this mess. Dr. Jeff Meldrum, a professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University, who has somehow managed to study Bigfoot without completely destroying his academic career, though he's definitely taken some hits along the way. Meldrum is basically the poster child for credentialed scientist who studies something his colleagues think is ridiculous, which is not exactly the career path most people envision when they're working on their doctorate in anatomical sciences. Here's what makes Meldrum interesting in a field full of enthusiastic amateurs and people with questionable credentials claiming to be experts. The guy actually has the academic background to know what he's talking about when it comes to primate anatomy and locomotion. He's got a PhD, a position at a legitimate university, and publications in peer-reviewed journals about primate foot evolution and bipedal locomotion. These are exactly the qualifications you'd want in someone analysing alleged footprints from an unknown primate. Unfortunately, the moment he started applying those qualifications to Bigfoot research, a significant portion of the scientific community decided he'd lost his mind and stopped taking him seriously, because academia can be harsh when you step outside acceptable research boundaries. Meldrum's collection of alleged Bigfoot footprint casts is genuinely impressive, though whether that's impressive in a good way or an "oh honey, what are you doing with your life" way depends entirely on who you ask. We're talking about over 300 plaster casts from locations across North America, collected over decades, each one documented with information about where it was found, who found it, what the conditions were, and what analysis has been performed. It's basically the world's largest collection of possible evidence for a creature that probably doesn't exist, organised with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that would make a librarian proud. The collection is stored at Idaho State University, which says something about the institution's tolerance for controversial research, or possibly their sense of humour. The way Meldrum approaches this collection is what sets him apart from the typical Bigfoot enthusiast who treats every footprint like definitive proof. He's applied actual scientific methodology to sorting through these casts, categorizing them based on various characteristics, and separating the ones that are obviously fake from the ones that are genuinely puzzling. His basic approach is that most alleged Bigfoot prints are probably hoaxes, misidentifications, or natural formations that happen to look vaguely foot-shaped, but there's a small subset that doesn't fit those categories and deserves serious investigation. It's a refreshingly skeptical stance for someone who's dedicated his career to studying a cryptid. The criteria Meldrum uses to evaluate footprints would make sense in any forensic context. He looks at the anatomy. Does the print show features consistent with a biological foot, or does it look like someone stamped around in carved wooden feet? He examines the biomechanics. Do the pressure patterns make sense for a living creature walking, or do they show the uniform depth you'd expect from a rigid fake? He considers the context. Was this print found in a location that would be difficult for a hoaxer to access, or is it conveniently located right next to a parking area where someone could easily tromp around in costume? He evaluates the source. Did this come from a credible witness with no apparent motive to lie, or from someone selling Bigfoot tours for $50 a person? What's fascinating is how many prints fail these basic tests. Meldrum estimates that probably 80 to 90% of the casts in his collection are either definite hoaxes or highly questionable at best. That's a pretty brutal rejection rate, but it's also exactly what you'd expect in a field this contaminated by fakes and misidentifications. The interesting part is that remaining 10 to 20% that can't be easily dismissed, the prints that show features Meldrum can't explain through known mechanisms of fakery or natural processes. These are the specimens that keep him investigating despite the professional costs. Let's talk about the mid-tarsal break, because this is where Meldrum's anatomical expertise becomes crucial to his analysis. In most primates except modern humans, the foot has a flexible point roughly in the middle, where it can bend during locomotion. Humans lost this flexibility as we evolved upright walking. Our feet became rigid platforms that efficiently transfer force for bipedal movement. You can actually see this evolution reflected in the fossil record, with early hominids showing more midfoot flexibility that gradually decreased as our ancestors became more committed to walking on two legs. This isn't obscure knowledge in anthropology circles, but it's definitely not something the general public knows about, and it wasn't widely discussed in Bigfoot research until Meldrum started pointing it out. Some of the footprint casts in Meldrum's collection show what appears to be a mid-tarsal break, evidence that the foot bent in the middle during the walking motion. You can see it in the pressure patterns and depth variations across the print, with clear evidence that the midfoot region flexed in ways human feet simply don't. Now, here's why this matters. A hoaxer creating fake Bigfoot prints in the 1960s or 70s almost certainly wouldn't have known to include this feature. They'd probably create prints based on scaled-up human feet or generic monster foot shapes, not anatomically accurate representations of non-human primate foot flexibility. The presence of mid-tarsal breaks in casts from that era suggests either an incredibly sophisticated level of anatomical knowledge in the hoaxers, or evidence of something genuinely anomalous. Meldrum's research into foot biomechanics has led him to some interesting conclusions about what these prints might represent if they're genuine. Based on the anatomy shown in the better specimens, he's proposed that if Bigfoot exists, it's likely some kind of giant ape that's adapted to bipedal locomotion, but retained certain primitive foot characteristics that humans lost. The foot structure suggests something that can walk upright efficiently, but hasn't completely committed to it the way Homo sapiens has. It's a plausible evolutionary scenario if you accept the premise that such a creature exists, though obviously that's a pretty big if. The database aspect of Meldrum's collection is where modern technology meets old-school cryptozoology. He's worked to digitize many of these casts, creating 3D scans that allow for detailed analysis and comparison. This means researchers can examine subtle features of prints from across the continent, looking for consistent anatomical patterns. If multiple unrelated prints from different locations show the same unusual characteristics, same type of mid-tarsal break, same toe proportions, same unusual anatomical features, that's either a coordinated hoaxing effort spanning decades and thousands of miles, or potentially evidence of a real creature with consistent anatomy. Neither option is particularly likely, which is why this whole field is so frustrating. The consistency argument is one Meldrum leans on heavily, and honestly, it's one of the more compelling aspects of his research. When you look at the prints he considers most credible, there are anatomical similarities that appear across specimens from different time periods and locations. The toe spread, the foot proportions, certain pressure distribution patterns, they show remarkable consistency for what would have to be independent hoaxes if they're all fake. It's like finding similar pottery designs at archaeological sites on different continents and having to decide if that indicates cultural contact or just coincidental similarity. Except instead of pottery, it's giant footprints, and instead of ancient civilizations, it's possibly imaginary apes. Meldrum's work has not made him popular with mainstream primatology and anthropology. Many of his colleagues consider his Bigfoot research to be a waste of his training and credentials, a detour into pseudoscience that undermines his legitimate academic work. He's been publicly criticized by other scientists, had trouble getting funding for his research, and dealt with skepticism about any of his work that touches on this subject. The academic establishment's message has been pretty clear. Studying Bigfoot is not acceptable, even if you approach it with rigorous methodology and appropriate skepticism. It's career suicide dressed up as cryptozoological research. But here's the thing about Meldrum. He's aware of all this criticism and keeps doing the research anyway. He's published a book about his findings, given presentations about his collection, and continues to analyze new casts as they come in. Either he's genuinely convinced there's something worth investigating here, and is willing to pay the professional cost, or he's incredibly committed to what would be an elaborate career-destroying bit. Given his academic credentials and the lack of obvious financial incentive for this research, the former seems more likely than the latter. The most compelling specimens in his collection are the ones that show multiple anatomical features that would be difficult to fake simultaneously. We're talking about prints with dermal ridges, appropriate pressure distribution, mid-tarsal breaks, natural variation between consecutive steps, and anatomical proportions that don't quite match human feet. Creating a fake that includes all these features would require extensive anatomical knowledge, sophisticated materials, and either remarkable luck or careful planning. It's not impossible. Humans have created convincing fakes of all sorts of things throughout history. But it raises the difficulty bar significantly above guy with wooden feet stomping around. One interesting aspect of Meldrum's research is how he's approached the question of size variation in the prints. The casts show a range of foot sizes from about 14 inches to over 18 inches, which could indicate different individuals of varying size, possibly including juveniles. If all these prints are hoaxes, it means multiple hoaxers independently decided to create different sizes of fake prints to simulate a population with natural size variation. That's a level of coordination and attention to detail that seems unlikely but not impossible. Alternatively, it could indicate actual biological variation in a real population, which would be compelling evidence if the prints weren't all potentially fake. The geographical distribution of the more credible casts is another factor Meldrum has examined. They cluster in specific regions, Pacific Northwest, Northern California, parts of the Rockies, which could indicate the habitat range of a real creature, or could indicate where the most enthusiastic Bigfoot researchers and hoaxers tend to operate. Correlation doesn't equal causation, and the fact that most prints come from areas where people are actively looking for Bigfoot evidence doesn't necessarily tell us anything about whether Bigfoot exists. It might just tell us where the most determined investigators and creative pranksters happen to live. Meldrum has also collaborated with biomechanics experts to analyze the gait patterns implied by trackways in his collection. Some sequences of prints show stride lengths and walking patterns that would be difficult for a human to replicate without specialized equipment or training. The natural flow of the steps, the consistent spacing, the way weight shifts from one foot to the next, these suggest either genuine locomotion by something large and bipedal, or hoaxers who really understood biomechanics and went to extraordinary lengths to create convincing fake trackways. Neither explanation is particularly satisfying from a scientific standpoint. The criticism Meldrum faces isn't just about studying Bigfoot, it's about how he frames his conclusions. He's careful to present his findings as unexplained, rather than definitely Bigfoot. But even that measured approach is too much for many scientists who think the entire premise is flawed. The argument from skeptics is basically that no amount of footprint analysis can prove the existence of an unknown primate without an actual specimen, and pursuing this research before having that specimen is putting the cart before the horse. It's not entirely unfair criticism. You really do need a body or living specimen to conclusively prove a new species exists, but it also creates a catch-22 where you can't investigate the evidence seriously until you've already proven the creature exists. The financial aspect of Meldrum's research raises interesting questions about how controversial science gets funded. He's not getting major grants from the National Science Foundation to study Bigfoot. That would be career suicide for whoever approved such a grant. Instead, funding for this work comes from private donors, organizations dedicated to cryptid research, and Meldrum's own resources. This means he's relatively independent from mainstream academic funding pressures, which allows him to pursue this work without having to justify it to grant committees, but it also means he has fewer resources than he would for conventional research. You can't hire a team of graduate students to help process your Bigfoot footprint collection when you're funding it out of pocket. The ethical questions around Meldrum's work are complex. On one hand, he's applying legitimate scientific methods to a question and following the evidence where it leads, which is basically what scientists are supposed to do. On the other hand, his research arguably legitimizes a field that's full of hoaxes and pseudoscience, potentially misleading people about the strength of evidence for Bigfoot's existence. Where you land on this question probably depends on whether you think it's better to ignore potentially anomalous evidence to avoid legitimizing nonsense, or to investigate everything with proper methodology, regardless of how unlikely the hypothesis seems. The academic isolation Meldrum experiences is a real consequence of pursuing controversial research. He's essentially a lone voice in mainstream academia, willing to publicly study this topic with scientific rigor. Other scientists who might be curious about these questions won't touch them because they've seen what happened to Meldrum's reputation. This creates a situation where the only people doing any research in this area are either enthusiastic amateurs without scientific training or researchers like Meldrum who've accepted the professional costs. It's not exactly conducive to good science when the only people willing to investigate are those who have nothing to lose or everything to gain. What makes Meldrum's database valuable, regardless of whether Bigfoot exists, is that it represents an organized collection of alleged evidence that can be systematically analyzed. Even if every single cast turns out to be fake or misidentified, having them catalogued and studied tells us something about the patterns of hoaxing, the cultural phenomenon of Bigfoot belief, and how people create and interpret ambiguous evidence. From an anthropological standpoint, the collection is interesting data about human behavior, even if it tells us nothing about unknown primates. The technological advances in 3D scanning and digital analysis have made Meldrum's collection more valuable for research purposes. What used to require physically examining plaster casts can now be done with detailed digital models that can be measured, compared, and analysed without handling the original specimens. This also means the data can be shared with other researchers globally, though finding researchers who want to publicly work on Bigfoot evidence remains challenging given the professional risks. Meldrum's response to skeptics and critics has generally been to point to the evidence and ask them to explain it through conventional means. He's not claiming every footprint is proof of Bigfoot. He's claiming some footprints show features that are difficult to explain as hoaxes or misidentifications and deserve investigation. It's a more nuanced position than either the true believers who accept everything as genuine or the hardcore skeptics who dismiss everything as fake without examination. Unfortunately, nuance doesn't get much traction in debates about cryptids, where people tend to line up firmly in one camp or the other. The database continues to grow as Meldrum receives new casts from researchers and investigators who find prints they can't explain. Each new specimen gets the same analytical treatment, documentation, measurement, comparison to known casts, evaluation for signs of hoaxing. Most don't make it into the genuinely puzzling category, but the ones that do add to the collection of evidence that either points toward an unknown primate or represent some truly sophisticated hoaxing that we haven't figured out yet. What Meldrum's work ultimately represents is an attempt to bring scientific methodology to a field that desperately needs it, but whose fundamental premise is rejected by most of mainstream science. He's caught between true believers who wish he'd be less skeptical of evidence and skeptics who wish he'd stop wasting his credentials on nonsense. It's an uncomfortable middle ground that satisfies absolutely no one but is probably the most scientifically honest position available, given the ambiguous nature of the evidence. Whether history will remember him as a scientist who investigated an important question that others ignored, or as a cautionary tale about what happens when you take cryptozoology seriously, remains to be seen. Either way, his collection of over 300 footprint casts represents the most organized, scientifically analyzed set of alleged Bigfoot evidence in existence, which is either a significant contribution to cryptozoology or an elaborate monument to wasted effort, depending on whether those prints represent something real or just decades of elaborate hoaxes. Now that we've established Meldrum has a database full of footprint casts that he can't entirely explain away, let's tackle the physics question that keeps both believers and skeptics up at night. Could a human actually create these prints? Not the obvious fakes, not the wooden feet stomping around, but the really good specimens that show anatomical complexity and realistic pressure patterns. Because here's the thing about physics. It doesn't care about your opinions or beliefs. Either the biomechanics work out or they don't, and if they don't, you've got to explain how someone managed to violate the laws of physics just to pull off an elaborate Bigfoot prank. Let's start with the most basic physics problem, weight and depth. When you step in soft ground, the depth of your footprint is determined by how much you weigh and how that weight is distributed across your foot. This is simple pressure calculation that engineers use all the time. A 180-pound human with size 10 feet creates a certain depth of impression in, say, clay soil. If you want to create impressions twice as deep, you need to either weigh significantly more or somehow concentrate your weight into a smaller area. Unfortunately for hoaxers, you can't just decide to weigh 600 pounds temporarily. Physics doesn't work that way, which is honestly inconvenient for anyone trying to fake giant footprint evidence. The alleged Bigfoot prints that Meldrum and others have examined show impression depths consistent with something weighing between 600 and 800 pounds. That's gorilla territory, roughly 3 to 4 times heavier than your average adult human. Creating those depth characteristics with a human weight hoaxer requires adding mass somehow, and that's where the biomechanics get complicated. You could strap weights to someone's body, but then they'd need to walk naturally while carrying an extra 400 to 600 pounds. which isn't exactly feasible without specialized equipment that would leave its own evidence in the terrain. It's like asking someone to casually stroll through the forest while wearing a refrigerator. Technically possible with enough determination, but not something that looks natural or leaves realistic footprints. Some skeptics have proposed that hoaxers could use mechanical devices to create deeper impressions, some kind of lever system or weighted stamps that press into the ground with greater force than human weight alone. This is actually a reasonable hypothesis that accounts for the physics problem. The issue is that mechanical devices tend to leave telltale signs in the footprints themselves. Stamps create unnaturally uniform depth because they apply force evenly across the entire surface. Real feet flex and shift weight dynamically, creating depth variations that are really hard to fake with a stamp. Plus, you'd need to tromp around placing these stamps in a natural walking pattern, which means the spacing and stride would need to be perfect, and getting mechanical devices to create that level of authenticity is harder than it sounds. Let's talk about stride length, because this is where the biomechanics argument gets really interesting. The better documented Bigfoot trackways show stride lengths, the distance from one footprint to the next, that consistently exceed what you'd expect from a human walking at the apparent speed suggested by the tracks. We're talking about steps that are 3 to 4 feet apart, sometimes even more, left by a creature that appears to be walking casually rather than running or jumping. For a human to achieve that stride length while walking slowly enough to create the kind of footprint depth we see, they'd need to be taking deliberately exaggerated steps, which creates its own biomechanical problems. Here's why exaggerated steps are problematic for hoaxers. When you deliberately take steps longer than your natural stride, your body mechanics change in noticeable ways. Your weight distribution becomes awkward, you create different pressure patterns in your footprints, and the overall flow of movement looks unnatural. It's like when you try to walk in someone else's footsteps in the snow. You can do it, but you end up moving in this weird stilted way that doesn't match natural walking. Experienced trackers and biomechanics experts can spot these irregularities in trackways, and many of the better alleged Bigfoot tracks don't show these telltale signs of forced or exaggerated stepping. Either the hoaxers were biomechanics geniuses who understood how to fake natural-looking extended stride patterns, or the tracks were made by something that naturally walked with that stride length. The relationship between stride length and body size follows predictable patterns in biology. Taller creatures naturally take longer steps because they have longer legs. A creature that's 7 to 8 feet tall would be expected to have a stride length proportional to its height, which works out to roughly the distances we see in alleged Bigfoot trackways. So the stride length is consistent with a very large bipedal creature walking naturally. The problem, obviously, is that we don't have any very large bipedal creatures wandering around North American forests, or at least we're not supposed to, which brings us back to the question of whether a human could fake these patterns convincingly. Pressure distribution analysis is where biomechanics gets forensically useful. When you walk, your heel strikes the ground first, taking most of the initial impact. Then your weight rolls forward across your foot toward your toes as you complete the step and push off for the next one. This creates a pressure gradient that shows up in high-quality footprints as variations in depth and definition. The heel tends to be deeper, the midfoot shows less pressure if you have a normal arch, and the ball of the foot and toes show increased pressure from the push-off. This pattern is so consistent in human walking that forensic experts can identify individuals based on their unique pressure distribution patterns. Some alleged Bigfoot prints show pressure distributions that don't quite match human patterns. The weight seems more evenly distributed across the entire foot, with less pronounced heel strike and less dramatic push-off from the toes. It's similar to how other great apes walk when they're being bipedal, more flat-footed than humans, without our specialized heel-to-toe rolling motion. Creating this kind of pressure pattern with a human hoaxer would require them to consciously modify their walking style, keeping their feet flatter and avoiding the natural heel-to-toe motion that humans do automatically. It's not impossible. People can learn to walk differently with practice, but maintaining that modified gait while also dealing with exaggerated stride length and whatever mechanism you're using to create deeper impressions starts to get really complicated. The toe spread in some prints is another biomechanical detail that's hard to fake convincingly. When you look at barefoot human footprints, the toes are usually relatively close together because we wear shoes that squeeze them into unnatural positions. People who've never worn shoes have more naturally spread toes, similar to our ancient ancestors. Some alleged Bigfoot prints show toe spread that's even more dramatic than unshod humans, with the big toe separated significantly from the other toes in a pattern that resembles great ape feet. Creating this with a fake foot would mean designing something that looks less like an enlarged human foot and more like a genuinely different anatomical structure, which again raises the sophistication level required for convincing hoaxing. Let's address the special effects question directly, because this is what skeptics often point to as an explanation. Modern special effects technology can create incredibly realistic creatures and costumes. Just look at any recent movie featuring non-human characters. Surely Hollywood could create footprints that fool researchers, right? Well, yes and no. The technology exists to create detailed foot molds that would leave realistic prints. But there's a difference between creating something that looks good on camera and creating something that would fool forensic analysis of plaster casts. Movie special effects are designed to be convincing to viewers watching from specific angles with specific lighting, not to withstand detailed scientific scrutiny. Plus, many of the more interesting alleged Bigfoot prints were found decades ago, long before modern special effects technology reached its current sophistication. The Patterson-Gimlin prints from 1967, for example, show anatomical details that would have been extremely difficult to fake with the materials and knowledge available at that time. Sure, 2020's special effects could probably create convincing fake Bigfoot tracks if someone really wanted to invest the time and money, but could 1960s backwoods pranksters do it with carved wooden feet and whatever materials they could scrounge up? The technological argument works better for recent prints than for historical specimens. The gait analysis aspect of biomechanics brings its own challenges for the hoax hypothesis. When you walk, your whole body moves in coordinated ways. Your arms swing in opposition to your legs, your torso rotates slightly with each step, your center of gravity shifts in predictable patterns. All of this shows up in the footprints you leave behind in subtle ways that aren't immediately obvious but become clear when you analyze entire trackways. The spacing between steps, the slight variations from one step to the next, the angle at which each foot is placed, these create a signature pattern that reflects your natural walking mechanics. Alleged Bigfoot trackways analyzed by biomechanics experts sometimes show gait patterns that don't quite match human locomotion. The rhythm of the steps, the way weight transfers from one foot to the next, the subtle variations that indicate natural walking rather than deliberately placed footprints, some of these trackways show characteristics that would be difficult for a human to replicate while also dealing with all the other hoaxing challenges we've discussed. You'd need to walk with modified gait, exaggerated stride length, altered pressure distribution, while also somehow creating footprints that look 600 to 800 pounds worth of deep, all while making it look natural enough to fool experts. That's a tall order, which is probably appropriate given we're talking about an allegedly 8-foot-tall creature. The terrain factor is another biomechanical consideration that doesn't get enough attention. Many alleged Bigfoot prints have been found in locations that would be genuinely challenging for a hoaxer to access, while carrying whatever equipment they'd need to create convincing fake prints. Remote wilderness areas, steep slopes, areas with no vehicle access. These are places where just getting there is difficult enough, let alone having the time and privacy to create elaborate fake trackways without being noticed. Obviously, determined hoaxers could potentially reach these locations, but it adds another layer of complexity to an already complicated hoax scenario. The consistency of biomechanical features across multiple unrelated trackways is something that bothers researchers on both sides of the debate. If all these prints are hoaxes, it means multiple independent hoaxers across different decades, and locations all decided to create tracks with similar stride lengths, similar pressure patterns, similar gait characteristics. That level of consistency suggests either some kind of shared hoaxing playbook that everyone's following, or these tracks are showing features of an actual biological entity with consistent anatomy and walking patterns. Neither explanation is particularly satisfying when you really think about it. Some biomechanics experts who've examined the better alleged Bigfoot evidence have concluded that the patterns would be extremely difficult, though not necessarily impossible, to fake using current special effects technology and unlimited resources, and would have been nearly impossible to fake decades ago when many of these prints were discovered. Other biomechanics experts look at the same evidence and conclude it's obviously fake because the alternative is accepting that an unknown primate exists, which violates what we think we know about North American wildlife. The disagreement often comes down to prior assumptions about what's possible rather than the evidence itself. The weight simulation experiments some researchers have conducted are genuinely interesting from a biomechanics standpoint. They've tried various methods to create footprints that match the depth and characteristics of alleged Bigfoot tracks: weighted stamps, mechanical devices, people in weighted costumes. The results have been mixed. They can replicate some features but struggle with others. Getting the depth right while maintaining natural-looking pressure distribution and realistic edge characteristics has proven surprisingly difficult. It's not that it's impossible, but it requires more sophistication than skeptics often assume when they dismiss all footprints as obvious fakes. The edge deformation patterns in footprints are subtle biomechanical details that reveal a lot about how the print was made. When a real biological foot steps into soft ground, the substrate deforms in specific ways around the edges based on how the skin and tissue compress against the ground. Rigid fake feet create different edge patterns. Some alleged Bigfoot prints show edge deformation consistent with soft, flexible tissue rather than rigid materials, which suggests either very sophisticated fake feet or real biological feet. Neither option makes skeptics comfortable. Computer modeling has allowed researchers to simulate what footprints would look like if made by creatures of various sizes and weights with different foot anatomies. These models can predict stride length, pressure distribution, depth of impression, and other biomechanical features based on the physical parameters you input. When researchers run these simulations using parameters consistent with an 8-foot, 600-pound bipedal ape, the results match many of the features seen in better alleged Bigfoot prints. This doesn't prove the prints are real, it just proves they're consistent with what you'd expect from such a creature if it existed. It's like running a computer simulation showing what dragons would look like if they were real, and finding that the results match medieval dragon descriptions. Interesting correlation, but not proof of dragons. The asymmetry argument is another biomechanical detail worth considering. Real creatures don't have perfectly symmetrical feet, and their walking patterns show natural variations from one step to the next. Some alleged Bigfoot trackways show these kinds of natural asymmetries and variations, while obvious hoaxes tend to show more uniform, repetitive patterns, because the hoaxer is using the same fake foot over and over. The presence of natural-looking variation doesn't prove authenticity, but its absence is pretty strong evidence of hoaxing. The physics of bipedal locomotion in very large creatures is an established field of study thanks to paleontology and the analysis of dinosaur trackways. We know what biomechanical features you'd expect in tracks left by large bipedal animals, because we've studied fossilized dinosaur tracks extensively. Some of those same principles apply to alleged Bigfoot prints: the way weight distributes, how stride length correlates with body size, what kind of pressure patterns large bipedal creatures create. The fact that better alleged Bigfoot tracks show features consistent with these known biomechanical principles suggests either very knowledgeable hoaxers or genuine biological evidence. Take your pick based on which seems more likely. What makes the biomechanics argument so frustrating for everyone involved is that it doesn't definitively prove anything either way. The physics could support the existence of a large bipedal creature leaving these prints, or it could support sufficiently sophisticated hoaxing. The evidence is consistent with both possibilities, which means everyone gets to maintain their existing beliefs without having to change their minds. Believers point to the biomechanical complexity as evidence that the prints must be real. Skeptics point to the lack of bodies as evidence that the prints must be fake. And meanwhile, the physics just sits there being annoyingly ambiguous about the whole situation. The bottom line on biomechanics is that creating footprints that match all the characteristics of the better alleged Bigfoot evidence would be difficult, but not impossible. It would require knowledge, resources, materials, and effort that exceed what most people assume when they picture someone stomping around in wooden fake feet. But difficulty isn't the same as impossibility, and the absence of a simple explanation for how the prints could be faked doesn't automatically mean they're genuine. The biomechanics make the hoax hypothesis more complicated, but complicated hoaxes have certainly been pulled off throughout history. What the biomechanics really tell us is that if these are all hoaxes, they're much more sophisticated than casual observers tend to assume, and if they're genuine evidence, then there's something very large and very bipedal walking around north. American forests that we somehow haven't definitively documented yet. Neither scenario is particularly comfortable for anyone hoping for simple, straightforward answers. After all that discussion about biomechanics and weight distribution, and whether a human could physically create these footprints, let's talk about what might be the most compelling, or most controversial, depending on who you ask, piece of evidence in the entire Bigfoot footprint debate. We're talking about dermal ridges, which are basically the fingerprints of your feet, except most people don't know they exist because unless you're a forensic scientist or a podiatrist, why would you? These tiny ridge patterns on the soles of your feet serve the same function as the ridges on your fingertips. They create friction, help with grip, and are unique to each individual, and some alleged Bigfoot footprint casts show them. Here's why this matters. Dermal ridges are incredibly difficult to fake convincingly, especially if you don't know they exist in the first place. When forensic investigators lifted the first detailed fingerprints for identification purposes back in the late 1800s, nobody was thinking about Bigfoot because the modern Bigfoot phenomenon didn't exist yet. These ridge patterns follow specific biological rules. They flow in consistent directions based on the anatomy of the foot. They show characteristics that are unique to individuals, and they have features that distinguish them from random texture. Patterns. Creating fake dermal ridges that would fool a forensic expert would require knowledge of these characteristics, plus the technical ability to incorporate them into fake feet that also show correct pressure distribution, appropriate weight depth, and natural biomechanics. That's a tall order for someone supposedly just trying to pull off a wilderness prank. The story of how dermal ridges became part of the Bigfoot evidence discussion is almost as interesting as the ridges themselves. In the 1990s, a police officer and fingerprint expert named Jimmy Chilcutt, who had absolutely zero interest in Bigfoot and probably thought the whole thing was nonsense, was asked to examine some footprint casts that allegedly showed dermal ridges. His initial reaction was basically, "Sure, I'll take a look and debunk this quickly so we can all move on with our lives." Chilcutt had spent his career analysing fingerprints and had developed expertise in primate dermal ridges by studying prints from gorillas, chimpanzees, and other great apes. He knew what human ridges looked like, he knew what other primate ridges looked like, and he was confident he'd be able to identify these alleged Bigfoot ridges as either human or fake. Plot twist: he couldn't. Chilcutt examined the casts and found ridge patterns that didn't match human characteristics, but also didn't match any known primate species in his reference collection. The ridges flowed in consistent directions, showed the kind of natural variation you'd expect from biological tissue, and had characteristics that would be extremely difficult to fake, especially in the time period when many of these casts were made. His conclusion, which probably surprised him as much as anyone, was that these ridges appeared to be genuine biological features from an unknown primate. This was not the outcome anyone expected from bringing in a skeptical forensic expert to debunk footprint evidence. The scientific community's reaction to Chilcutt's findings was about what you'd expect, mostly dismissive, with a generous helping of "clearly he's been fooled somehow," and a side of "this is career suicide for his credibility." Because here's the problem with being a mainstream expert who examines controversial evidence and concludes it might be genuine, nobody wants to hear it. If you conclude the evidence is fake, everyone nods and moves on. If you conclude it might be real, you get accused of being incompetent, biased, or secretly a true believer who's abandoned scientific objectivity. It's a no-win situation that discourages qualified experts from examining controversial evidence in the first place. Let's break down what dermal ridges actually look like and why they matter. On human feet, these ridges form patterns that are generally parallel and relatively uniform, with specific characteristics that forensic experts can use for identification. The ridges have a certain density, meaning how many ridges appear per unit of measurement, and they flow in directions determined by the underlying anatomy of the foot. On the ball of the foot and toes, ridges tend to flow in curved patterns around the high-pressure areas. On the heel, they're usually more linear. These aren't random. They follow biological rules based on how skin forms during fetal development. The alleged Bigfoot dermal ridges show patterns that are similar enough to primate ridges to be recognizable as biological, but different enough from human patterns to be anomalous. The ridge flow is similar but not identical to what you'd see on human feet. The density is different. The ridges are spaced differently than human ridges. The overall pattern suggests something that's related to humans and other great apes, but distinct from all known species. It's like finding a language that uses familiar letters but puts them together in ways that don't match any known language. Familiar enough to recognize as language, different enough to be puzzling. Now, the skeptical argument against dermal ridges as evidence is actually pretty reasonable. When you pour plaster into a footprint to make a cast, the process can create texture patterns that might look like ridges to an optimistic observer. The interaction between wet plaster and the substrate, whether it's mud, sand or soil, can produce lines, patterns and textures that aren't actually biological, but could be mistaken for dermal ridges if you're not careful. Confirmation bias is real, and if you're desperately hoping to find evidence of Bigfoot, you might interpret random texture as meaningful biological detail. It's the equivalent of seeing faces in clouds or Jesus in your toast. Human brains are excellent at finding patterns even when those patterns are just random noise. The counter-argument from believers is that the ridges in the better specimens show characteristics that random casting artifacts wouldn't produce. The ridges flow in anatomically consistent patterns across the entire surface of the cast. They show the kind of natural variation, slight differences in spacing, occasional interruptions where ridges split or merge, that you'd expect from biological tissue. They appear in multiple casts from different locations made by different researchers using different casting techniques, which suggests a consistent source rather than random artifacts from the casting process. If these were all casting artifacts, why would they consistently mimic biological ridge patterns rather than showing random textures? The ridge density argument is particularly interesting from a technical standpoint. Human dermal ridges have a fairly consistent density. There are roughly 9 to 11 ridges per centimetre on most areas of the foot. The alleged Bigfoot ridges show lower density, with fewer ridges per centimetre, which is consistent with what you'd expect on a larger foot from a larger primate. Bigger hands and feet generally have lower ridge density than smaller ones. It's a scaling relationship that makes biological sense. For a hoaxer to include this detail, they'd need to understand ridge density scaling and then create fake feet with appropriately scaled ridge patterns. That's a level of sophistication that seems unlikely for someone making fake Bigfoot tracks in their garage, especially decades ago when knowledge about dermal ridges wasn't widely available outside forensic and anthropological circles. The temporal aspect is crucial here. Many of the casts showing dermal ridges were made in the 1960s, 70s and 80s, before dermal ridge analysis became a well-known part of Bigfoot research. Hoaxers creating fake prints during that period wouldn't have known to include dermal ridges, because it wasn't something researchers were looking for yet. It's similar to how movies from the 1950s accidentally got some scientific details right that weren't understood until decades later, either remarkable coincidence or they were depicting something real. Neither option is particularly comfortable for skeptics. The consistency across unrelated specimens is what keeps this evidence from being easily dismissed. We're not talking about one cast that might show ridges. We're talking about multiple casts from different states, found by different people, made in different decades, all showing ridge patterns with similar characteristics that don't match known primates. Either there's a sophisticated hoaxing conspiracy spanning decades and thousands of miles where everyone agreed on how fake Bigfoot dermal ridges should look, or these casts are capturing genuine biological features from an unknown creature. Both explanations require accepting something pretty extraordinary. Some forensic experts who've examined these casts have concluded they're probably artifacts from the casting process, while others like Chilcutt have concluded they appear genuinely biological. The disagreement often comes down to how you interpret ambiguous features and what your prior assumptions are about the possibility of unknown primates existing. If you think Bigfoot is impossible, then any evidence must be fake or misidentified, so dermal ridges must be casting artifacts regardless of how biological they appear. If you think Bigfoot is possible, then genuine-looking dermal ridges might actually be genuine. The evidence itself doesn't resolve this disagreement because both interpretations are defensible based on the data. The experimental approach to testing the artifact hypothesis has yielded interesting results. Researchers have tried to create casting artifacts that mimic dermal ridges by pouring plaster into various substrates under different conditions. They've been able to create some texture patterns, but producing anything that closely mimics the complexity and consistency of the alleged Bigfoot ridges has proven difficult. This doesn't prove the ridges are real. It just proves that if they're artifacts, the mechanism that creates them isn't simple or obvious. Maybe there's some combination of substrate type, moisture level, plaster chemistry, and casting technique that reliably produces ridge-like patterns, and we just haven't figured out what that combination is yet. The anatomical flow of the ridges is another detail that's hard to fake by accident. In the better specimens, the ridges flow in directions that make sense based on the alleged anatomy of the foot. They curve around pressure points, follow the contours of what would be anatomical features, and show patterns consistent with how dermal ridges develop on primate feet. If these are artifacts, they're remarkably anatomically accurate artifacts. If they're deliberate fakes, they're remarkably sophisticated fakes created with knowledge that most people don't have. If they're genuine, then we're looking at actual biological evidence from an unknown creature. None of these options is particularly satisfying. The ridge characteristics themselves show features that forensic experts use to identify individuals. There are ridge endings where a ridge terminates, bifurcations where one ridge splits into two, and dots where very short ridges appear. These minutiae points are what make fingerprints unique. No two individuals have the same pattern of ridge characteristics. Some alleged Bigfoot casts show these minutiae points in patterns that appear random and natural rather than deliberately placed. Creating this level of detail in fake ridges would require either remarkable skill or remarkable luck, and maintaining that level of detail across multiple supposedly unrelated specimens seems statistically unlikely. The chemical analysis of the casts is another avenue of investigation that's been explored with mixed results. Some researchers have examined the actual plaster material to see if there's any evidence of manipulation or artificial texturing. The results haven't been conclusive. Some tests suggest the ridges are integral to the casting process rather than added afterward, but that doesn't tell us whether they're biological impressions or artifacts. It's like analysing a photograph to determine if it's been manipulated. You can detect some types of fakery but not others. An absence of detected manipulation doesn't prove authenticity. What makes dermal ridges potentially game-changing as evidence is that they're either genuine or they're not. There's less room for interpretation than with biomechanics or gait analysis. Either these are biological ridge patterns from an unknown primate, or they're artifacts, or they're deliberate fakes. The problem is definitively determining which category they fall into without having a known Bigfoot foot to compare against. It's the same catch-22 that plagues all Bigfoot evidence. You need a specimen to confirm the evidence, but you need evidence to justify seriously looking for a specimen. The impact of the dermal ridge evidence on the broader Bigfoot research community has been significant. For believers, it's often cited as the strongest proof that at least some footprints are genuine biological evidence. For skeptics, it's usually dismissed as either artifacts or sophisticated hoaxing that doesn't rise to the level of proof required for accepting the existence of an unknown species. For researchers like Chilcutt, who examined the evidence professionally, it created a genuine puzzle that didn't have an easy answer, which is probably the most honest position available given how ambiguous this evidence actually is. So are dermal ridges the game changer that proves Bigfoot exists? Not quite. They're compelling evidence that deserves serious analysis, but they're not definitive proof. They make the hoax hypothesis more complicated and raise questions about how these patterns got into the casts, but they don't conclusively prove anything without additional corroborating evidence. What they do is add another layer to the mystery, another piece of the puzzle that doesn't quite fit either the all fake or definitely real narratives. And honestly, that's pretty much where we've been with Bigfoot evidence all along. Perpetually intriguing, never quite conclusive, always leaving room for both skeptics and believers to maintain their positions without having to admit they might be wrong. Now let's talk about how modern technology has completely changed the game for Bigfoot research, though not necessarily in ways that have settled any debates or made anyone happy. Thermal imaging cameras, the same technology that lets military forces detect enemy positions at night and that home inspectors use to find heat leaks in your walls, have become standard equipment for serious Bigfoot investigators. Because here's the thing, if there are large, warm-blooded creatures wandering around in the forest at night, they should show up as bright heat signatures on thermal cameras, and sometimes, allegedly, they do. Thermal imaging works on a beautifully simple principle. Everything that's warmer than absolute zero emits infrared radiation, and the hotter something is, the more infrared it emits. Thermal cameras detect this radiation and convert it into a visible image where hot things show up as bright colors and cold things show up as dark colors. A living creature with normal mammalian body temperature stands out like a beacon against the cooler forest background, which is why thermal imaging is so useful for wildlife observation. Deer, bears, raccoons, humans, they all create clear thermal signatures that are easily distinguishable from their surroundings. If there are 8-foot-tall mystery apes out there, thermal imaging should spot them pretty easily. The technology has become remarkably affordable and accessible over the past couple decades. What used to require military-grade equipment costing tens of thousands of dollars can now be done with consumer thermal cameras that cost a few $100 and attach to your smartphone. Not exactly professional grade, but good enough to detect large heat signatures in the woods. This democratization of technology means that there are hundreds of amateur researchers wandering around forests at night with thermal cameras, hoping to capture evidence of something anomalous. It's like the smartphone era made everyone a potential Bigfoot investigator, which is either democratizing research or flooding the field with low-quality data depending on your perspective. Here's where it gets interesting for footprint research. Some investigators claim they've detected large heat signatures moving through the forest, tracked those signatures with their thermal cameras, and then found footprints in the locations where the thermal signature was moving. The combination of real-time thermal data showing something large and warm-blooded in a specific location, followed by physical footprints in that same location, creates a more compelling case than either piece of evidence alone. It's like having video surveillance showing someone near a crime scene plus physical evidence at the scene. The combination is stronger than either element individually. Let's examine what this actually looks like in practice. Researchers set up thermal cameras in areas with reported Bigfoot activity, which is already a selection bias issue because areas with reported activity are usually places where people are actively looking for Bigfoot, and thus more likely to interpret ambiguous evidence as significant. They monitor these cameras for unusual heat signatures, something larger than deer, moving bipedally, appearing in locations where humans typically wouldn't be. When they detect something interesting, they either track it in real time or return to the location afterward to check for physical evidence like footprints. The success rate of actually finding footprints associated with thermal signatures is, unsurprisingly, pretty low. Most thermal hits turn out to be known animals, bears standing on their hind legs, deer at odd angles that make them look bigger than they are, humans who didn't realize they were in an area under surveillance. It's the same pattern we see with all Bigfoot evidence. Lots of false alarms, occasional genuinely puzzling data, nothing definitively conclusive. But the cases where investigators claim to have both thermal data and corresponding footprints are the ones that get attention and generate debate. One of the challenges with thermal imaging evidence is that it's really hard to judge size and distance without reference points. That heat signature that looks like it's 8 feet tall and 50 yards away might actually be a 6-foot human 100 yards away, or a large dog much closer. Thermal cameras don't provide the same depth perception and size estimation that visual cameras do, which means interpreting what you're seeing requires experience and judgment. Unfortunately, experience and judgment are exactly the things that confirmation bias undermines. If you're convinced you're looking at Bigfoot, you'll interpret ambiguous thermal data as confirmation, rather than questioning whether there might be more. Mundane explanations. The conditions under which thermal imaging works best for potential Bigfoot detection are also conditions that make verification difficult. Thermal cameras are most effective at night when the temperature differential between warm-blooded creatures and their surroundings is greatest. But nighttime is also when it's hardest to verify footprints, examine terrain, or rule out other explanations for heat signatures. By the time investigators return in daylight to look for tracks, conditions may have changed. Weather, other animals, or natural processes might have obscured or destroyed any footprints that were there. The temporal gap between thermal detection and physical verification creates opportunities for error and misinterpretation. Some of the more compelling thermal imaging cases involve multiple cameras capturing the same signature from different angles, which helps with size estimation and rules out some types of misidentification. If two cameras positioned hundreds of yards apart both show a large heat signature moving through the same area at the same time, that provides better data than a single camera observation. When investigators then find footprints in the path that thermal signature appeared to follow, the coincidence becomes harder to dismiss as pure chance. It's still not proof. Correlation isn't causation and all that. But it's more interesting than isolated footprint discoveries with no supporting context. The hoaxing question with thermal imaging gets complicated. A dedicated hoaxer could theoretically create thermal signatures by wearing temperature-controlled clothing or using other heat sources, but they'd need to know they were being monitored and would need to coordinate their thermal signature with whatever method they're using to create fake footprints. That's a more sophisticated operation than simple wooden feet stomping around, though certainly not impossible for someone with resources and planning. The question becomes whether hoaxers would go to that level of effort for what's essentially an elaborate prank with limited payoff. Weather conditions dramatically affect thermal imaging effectiveness, which creates both opportunities and challenges for Bigfoot research. Cold nights with low humidity are ideal for thermal detection, because the temperature differential is high and atmospheric interference is low. But these same conditions might not be ideal for footprint preservation. Frozen ground doesn't take impressions well, and lack of moisture means footprints won't be as clear. There's a frustrating mismatch between optimal thermal imaging conditions and optimal footprint preservation conditions that makes coordinating both types of evidence tricky. The combination of thermal data and footprints is most compelling when it happens in remote locations that would be difficult for hoaxers to access and monitor. If investigators are using thermal cameras in deep wilderness areas that require significant hiking to reach, and they detect heat signatures followed by finding footprints, the hoax hypothesis becomes more complicated. Not impossible, determined hoaxers could potentially access these locations, but it requires attributing more planning, effort, and resources to hoaxers than skeptics usually assume. It's easier to dismiss evidence as hoaxing when you can imagine simple mechanisms for fakery than when the fakery would require elaborate planning and execution. Some researchers have reported thermal signatures that show behavior patterns consistent with something avoiding detection, heat sources that appear to track the investigators' movements, that maintain distance while paralleling their path, that seem aware of camera positions and stay outside direct line of sight. This kind of sophisticated behavior would be consistent with an intelligent creature that's learned to avoid human contact, or with humans deliberately hoaxing in ways designed to seem convincing. Again, both explanations are possible, neither is provable without additional evidence. The technological arms race in Bigfoot research has led to increasingly sophisticated equipment and techniques. Multiple thermal cameras covering the same area from different positions, motion-triggered setups that activate when heat signatures are detected, integration of thermal data with regular video, audio recording, and other monitoring systems. It's impressively thorough documentation of, mostly known animals and occasional ambiguous heat signatures. The technology has improved dramatically, but the evidence remains frustratingly inconclusive, which suggests the problem isn't lack of good equipment, but rather the fundamental difficulty of documenting something that either doesn't exist or is remarkably good at avoiding detection. The interpretation challenges with thermal imaging data are significant. A blob of bright color on a thermal display could be many things: bear, elk, human, equipment malfunction, atmospheric anomaly, or yes, potentially an unknown primate. Without additional context and supporting evidence, it's just an ambiguous heat signature. The footprints provide that additional context when they're found in locations consistent with the thermal data, but footprints themselves are ambiguous evidence as we've thoroughly discussed. So you end up with two pieces of ambiguous evidence that might support each other, or might just be coincidentally occurring in the same general area for unrelated reasons. The timing correlation between thermal detections and footprint discoveries is crucial for evaluating these combined evidence cases. If researchers detect a heat signature, immediately investigate the area, and find fresh footprints in the snow or soft ground that clearly show the path the signature followed, that's much more compelling than detecting a signature one night and finding some footprints in the general area the next day that might or might not be related. The tighter the temporal correlation, the harder it is to dismiss as coincidence, but the fewer cases there are with truly tight correlation. One interesting aspect of thermal imaging research is that it's generated a lot of video documentation of known animals behaving in ways that could be misinterpreted as Bigfoot evidence. Bears standing upright, elk at odd angles, even cattle in unexpected locations have all been captured on thermal cameras and initially mistaken for something more exotic. This documentation is actually valuable for the research community because it helps calibrate what normal animals look like on thermal imaging and reduces the likelihood of misidentification. It's the inverse of finding Bigfoot. Instead of proving the creature exists, they're proving that a lot of heat signatures that look anomalous are actually just bears. The footprint verification aspect requires careful documentation to be convincing. Researchers need to show that the footprints they found are actually in the location where the thermal signature was detected, that they're fresh enough to have been made during the time frame of the thermal observation, and that they have characteristics suggesting they weren't made by known animals or humans. That's a high bar to clear, and most thermal detection cases don't have sufficiently rigorous documentation to meet it. But the cases that do clear this bar are genuinely intriguing, even if they're not definitive proof of anything. The psychological impact of having multiple types of evidence from the same incident is worth considering. If you just find footprints, you can question whether they're real. If you just have thermal signatures, you can question whether they're misidentified animals. But when you have both, thermal detection followed by footprint discovery in the same location, the combined effect makes it harder to dismiss either piece of evidence. This is actually how good detective work operates. Multiple independent lines of evidence that corroborate each other are more convincing than any single piece. The problem in Bigfoot research is that even multiple lines of evidence don't rise to the level of proof required for accepting the existence of an unknown species. So has thermal imaging changed the game in Bigfoot research? It's provided new tools and new types of documentation, created more data to analyze, and occasionally produced intriguing combinations of thermal signatures and physical footprints. But it hasn't produced the definitive proof that would settle the debate. Clear thermal footage of an obviously non-human bipedal creature that's then tracked to a location where unambiguous footprints are found and documented before the creature can escape. That combination would be compelling evidence. What we've gotten instead is a lot of ambiguous heat signatures, occasional interesting correlations with footprints, and enough tantalizing data to keep researchers looking, but not enough to convince skeptics that there's actually something worth looking for. Which is basically where we've always been with Bigfoot evidence, just now with more expensive equipment to document our continued lack of definitive conclusions. After all the thermal imaging and dermal ridge debates, let's talk about what happens when alleged Bigfoot evidence gets dragged into an actual laboratory. Because here's the thing, you can argue about footprints in the forest all you want, but once you start doing microscopic analysis, soil composition studies, and 3D modelling, the evidence either holds up or it doesn't. And unsurprisingly, most of it doesn't. Laboratory testing has revealed some genuinely embarrassing hoaxes. Microscopic examination has shown tool marks in casts where someone clearly carved the original foot from wood or foam. You can actually see the striations from carving tools and unnaturally uniform texture. Soil composition analysis has exposed other frauds, revealing soil types that don't exist anywhere near the alleged discovery location. The 3D modelling analysis is where modern technology really shines. Researchers create detailed scans and analyse compression patterns that reveal how a print was made. Real biological feet compress substrate in specific ways based on weight distribution and flexibility. Rigid fake feet create different signatures, usually more uniform pressure and sharper edges. Some prints have failed testing spectacularly. One case involved casts showing fabric texture in the skin patterns. Someone had wrapped carved forms in burlap. Another revealed dermal ridges that were actually tire tread patterns. These fails show exactly what not to do when creating fake Bigfoot evidence. But some casts have passed extensive laboratory analysis without revealing obvious hoaxing. Microscopic examination shows texture consistent with skin. Soil analysis confirms the substrate matches the discovery location. 3D modelling reveals biological-looking compression patterns. These cases leave researchers genuinely puzzled, unable to definitively classify them as either hoaxes or genuine evidence. The inability to prove something as fake doesn't mean it's real, a crucial distinction that gets lost in enthusiastic discussions. Science requires positive evidence for existence, not just absence of evidence for fakery. The burden of proof remains on those claiming these prints represent an unknown species. Statistical analysis comparing multiple casts has revealed patterns. Consistent anatomical features appearing across specimens could indicate either a real creature or hoaxes copying each other's work. Chemical analysis has exposed manipulation in some casts, revealing materials added after casting or aging characteristics inconsistent with their alleged discovery date. The honest assessment: laboratory testing is excellent at identifying bad evidence, but can't definitively prove good evidence is genuine. A cast that fails tests is almost certainly fake. A cast that passes is possibly genuine, possibly a very good fake, possibly a natural formation. The scientific method doesn't love ambiguity, but ambiguity is what we're stuck with here. Now let's talk about something that predates the modern Bigfoot phenomenon: indigenous knowledge about these creatures. Native American tribes across North America have had stories about massive, hairy, human-like beings for centuries, long before white settlers showed up. These aren't vague monster stories. Many tribes have specific names and detailed descriptions. The Salish peoples have the Sasquatch, literally where the modern English term comes from. The Cherokee speak of the Nunyunuwi. The Lakota know the Chiatanka. Dozens of distinct tribal traditions, spanning thousands of miles, all describing similar beings, large, hairy, bipedal creatures that live in forests, generally avoid humans, and occupy a space between animal and spirit. The skeptical view, humans everywhere create similar monster myths because we have similar fears and storytelling traditions. Forest-dwelling giants appear in folklore worldwide. Maybe indigenous stories are just the local version of universal mythological patterns. The believer view. These stories represent accumulated knowledge about actual creatures sharing the landscape with humans. If indigenous peoples have been encountering these beings for thousands of years, that's what you'd expect if they were real. The consistency across unrelated tribes suggests actual observations rather than independent invention. What's interesting is how many accounts treat these beings as just another part of nature rather than supernatural monsters. Some tribes considered them dangerous and avoided them, others saw them as spiritual beings, but there's often a matter-of-fact quality that differs from obviously mythological stories. The challenge with using indigenous knowledge as evidence is distinguishing literal descriptions from metaphorical stories, practical knowledge from spiritual teaching. Many indigenous traditions intentionally blur these categories. A being can be both literally real and spiritually significant without contradiction. Researchers who've worked with indigenous communities have documented accounts with physical descriptions matching modern reports. 8 feet tall, covered in hair, human-like faces, strong smell, bipedal. They include behavioral observations, mostly nocturnal, avoids humans, makes vocalizations, leaves large footprints. If you created a biological profile based solely on indigenous accounts, you'd get something remarkably similar to what modern researchers describe. But you'd also encounter supernatural elements, disappearing at will, shape-shifting, telepathic communication. These don't fit the flesh and blood primate hypothesis most researchers favor. Either these are metaphorical descriptions, cultural beliefs around observations of real creatures, or evidence we're dealing with something outside conventional understanding. The respectful approach requires acknowledging these aren't just anecdotes to mine for evidence. They're important cultural traditions with their own context separate from cryptozoological debates. What the indigenous knowledge tells us is that the idea of large, hairy, human-like beings isn't a recent invention. Whether that comes from actual encounters or deep psychological patterns generating similar myths remains an open question. Alright, we've covered a lot of ground here, literally and figuratively. We've examined the Patterson-Gimlin footage, dissected footprint analysis techniques, exposed elaborate hoaxes, explored Meldrum's database, wrestled with biomechanics, puzzled over dermal ridges, played with thermal cameras, subjected everything to laboratory tests and considered centuries of indigenous knowledge. So what does it all actually mean? Where does the evidence point? And most importantly, is Bigfoot real, or have we spent this entire journey examining the world's most persistent prank? Here's the honest answer that will satisfy absolutely nobody. The evidence is genuinely ambiguous. Some of it is obviously fake, some of it is genuinely puzzling, and a whole lot of it falls somewhere in between. There's no smoking gun that definitively proves Bigfoot exists, but there's also no comprehensive explanation that accounts for all the interesting evidence as hoaxes or misidentifications. Both the believers and the skeptics have legitimate points, and neither side can claim total victory without ignoring inconvenient facts. Let's start with what we can say confidently. Most alleged Bigfoot evidence is fake, misidentified, or natural formations. Wallace's wooden feet launched a phenomenon based on fraud. Countless people have created fakes for attention or money. Theirs are responsible for many reports. Most footprints examined closely have obvious problems. The hoax problem is real and pervasive. But there's a subset of evidence that doesn't fit neatly into hoax or misidentification. Footprints with anatomical details like mid-tarsal breaks that would have been difficult for historical hoaxers to fake. Dermal ridges showing patterns inconsistent with human feet, but consistent with biological tissue. Biomechanical characteristics requiring sophisticated understanding to fake. Thermal imaging correlations with tracks and conditions making hoaxing unlikely. Indigenous accounts spanning centuries describing similar creatures across vast distances. None of this evidence is definitive proof. All of it could potentially be explained through some combination of sophisticated hoaxing, natural processes we don't fully understand, and cultural patterns that create similar mythologies. But the explanations required to dismiss all the interesting evidence as fake or misidentified start to get pretty complicated. You need hoaxes with extensive anatomical knowledge creating prints decades before that knowledge was common. You need multiple independent hoaxing efforts that somehow produce consistent anatomical features across unrelated specimens. You need cultural traditions that independently invented the same mythological creature across dozens of tribes with no contact. The skeptical position: extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and Bigfoot evidence doesn't rise to that level. No body, no DNA from an unknown primate, no crystal clear video. Until we have specimens, the default should be that Bigfoot doesn't exist. The believer position: too much smoke for no fire. The volume of reports, consistency of descriptions, physical evidence that can't be easily explained, indigenous knowledge, genuinely puzzling footprints, it suggests something real is being observed. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, especially for a rare, intelligent creature in vast wilderness. The scientific consensus leans heavily skeptical. Most mainstream scientists won't touch Bigfoot research. It's considered pseudoscience. The burden of proof requires actual specimens, not just footprints and accounts. Without a body or living specimen, Bigfoot remains in cryptozoology, not zoology. Where does that leave us? If you're waiting for science to definitively prove Bigfoot before believing, you'll probably wait forever unless someone produces a specimen. If you're convinced based on existing evidence, no skeptical argument will likely change your mind. The evidence is strong enough to maintain belief but not strong enough to compel it. The truth might be more nuanced than definitely exists or all hoaxes. Maybe something creates consistent patterns of reports. Maybe natural phenomena create footprint-like formations we don't understand. Maybe the cultural tradition influences how people interpret ambiguous observations. Or maybe there really is an unknown primate, rare and smart enough to avoid definitive detection for centuries, leaving just enough evidence to keep the mystery alive. People will keep looking. Researchers will continue analyzing footprints and searching with thermal cameras. Hoaxers will continue creating fakes. Skeptics will dismiss everything. Believers will insist the evidence speaks for itself. And somewhere in North America there either is or isn't a large, hairy, bipedal creature we haven't documented yet. The mystery endures because the evidence allows it to. It's ambiguous enough that both sides can claim support, strong enough to maintain interest but not strong enough to compel consensus. Maybe that's what makes this mystery compelling, the genuine uncertainty, the possibility there's something we haven't figured out yet. So is Bigfoot real? The honest answer: we don't know, the evidence is unclear, and anyone claiming absolute certainty either way is letting biases override objectivity. The best evidence deserves serious investigation, the worst deserves to be called out as fraud, and the truth is probably somewhere in between. And hey, maybe the real Bigfoot was the friends we made arguing about footprints along the way. Or maybe it's an 8-foot ape that's really good at hide and seek. The mystery continues. Thanks for joining this journey through cryptozoology's hairiest controversy. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm curious where you land after examining everything. Until next time, keep your cameras ready and your skepticism healthy. You never know what you might find in the woods.